In the autumn of 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the port of Messina in Sicily after a long voyage from the east. The people waiting on the docks expected silk, spices, and other treasures. What they got instead was horror. Most of the sailors aboard were dead. Those still clinging to life were feverish, coughing blood, and covered in strained black swellings the size of eggs, boils that festered and burst. Terrified port authorities ordered the ships back out to sea, but it was too late. The Black Death had arrived. Within days, the disease spread like wildfire through the port. Messina was gripped by panic. Entire households perished within a week. Clergy who offered last rites dropped dead in the streets. No one could explain what was happening. Rumors swirled. This was divine punishment, a curse, or perhaps the work of enemies. People fell back on superstition. Bells rang day and night. Incense clouded churches, and flagellants whipped themselves in public squares hoping to appease God. Nothing worked. And yet, the real killer remained invisible to all. It didn't carry a sword or ride on horseback. It had no face, no voice. It was small enough to cling to the hairs on a rat's back or hide in the seams of a traveler's cloak. The true architects of the plague were fleas, tiny parasites who had no idea they were rewriting human history. At the time, the world was more connected than ever before. Europe was trading with Asia, Africa, and the Middle East via vast overland routes and bustling seaports. Ideas, people, and goods flowed with unprecedented speed, and so did disease. The Silk Road, once a symbol of prosperity, now became the path of death. Along it, plague-infested rodents and their flea passengers journeyed westward. Rats were everywhere, on ships, in homes, marketplaces, monasteries. They were so common that most people hardly noticed them. And with the rats came the fleas. When a rat died, its fleas sought a new host, a dog, a child, a merchant. Once attached, the flea bit, and in doing so, released the bacterium Yersinia pestis into the victim's bloodstream. The infection began within hours, and death often followed in days. From Sicily, the plague spread northward into mainland Italy. Venice, Pisa, and Florence succumbed quickly. By 1348, the disease reached France, Spain, and England. It moved as fast as the merchants who unknowingly carried it and the rats that lurked in their holds. Medieval cities, overcrowded and filthy, became perfect breeding grounds. The death toll skyrocketed. And still, people did not know what they were fighting. Many believed the air itself was poisoned, a theory known as miasma. Doctors wore bird-like masks stuffed with herbs and spices to filter the air. But the true cause of the Black Death wasn't in the air. It was in the blood. And the fleas, unseen and unstoppable, continued to feed. What made the situation worse was the social structure time. Cities lacked proper sanitation. Trash and human waste were dumped in the streets. Fresh water was scarce. People lived packed together, which made contagion swift and inescapable. The very conditions of life made the spread of the plague inevitable, but no one yet connected the dots. By the time anyone grasped the scale of the devastation, it was far too late. In just a few short years, the plague would kill an estimated 25 to 50 million people in Europe, up to half the population. Entire towns would vanish. Fields would go untilled. Churches would stand empty. A continent would be forever changed. And at the heart of it all was a parasite the size of sesame seed, an insect so small it went unnoticed, yet so deadly it became history's most efficient killer. To trace the origins of the Black Death, one must travel far from the cobbled streets of Europe and deep into the windswept grasslands and mountains of Central Asia. Long before plague ships docked in Sicily, long before rats ran through the alleys of London and Paris, the bacterium Yersinia pestis was already lurking in the bodies of marmots and gerbils. These small, unassuming rodents were the natural reservoirs of the plague, hosts who lived with the bacteria in a delicate balance that rarely resulted in mass death. But that balance was fragile. In the 13th and 14th centuries, a great shift occurred. The Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan and his successors had forged the largest contiguous empire in history, stretching from the Korean peninsula to the edges of Eastern Europe. With that empire came the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative peace and security that allowed trade to flourish across the Silk Road. Caravans traveled from China to the Middle East and eventually into Europe, bringing with them spices, silks, porcelain, and death. Traders and soldiers passing through the rodent-rich steppes often camped near marmot colonies. In doing so, they disturbed the animals' burrows and exposed themselves to infected fleas. Once a flea latched onto a new host, be a camel, a human, or another rodent, the bacteria had a new pathway to spread. Fleas do not respect borders or empires. They simply seek warmth, fur, and blood. The bacterium Yersinia pestis is a microscopic killer with deadly efficiency. Once inside a flea, it multiplies rapidly in the insect's gut. It creates a blockage that prevents the flea from swallowing properly. Driven mad by hunger, the flea bites its host over and over again, regurgitating infected blood into the wound each time. This brutal biological mechanism transforms a mere insect into a deadly syringe, injecting plague into every bite. As the infected fleas hitched rides on rodents and livestock, the bacterium began to migrate. One of the key transit points was the city of Sarai on the Volga River, a major hub of the Mongol Empire. From there, infected animals and goods were carried down to the Black Sea, especially to the city of Kaffa, a Genoese trading outpost that would soon become infamous. European merchants stationed in Kaffa played a crucial role in what was to come. Though they could not have known it, they were helping to bridge two worlds, East and West, by participating in this vast, interconnected network of trade. But their ships did more than carry cargo. Hidden below decks, in sacks of grain, and beneath ropes and crates, rats bred and multiplied. And with them came the fleas. These fleas didn't discriminate. They jumped from rodent to rodent, from animal to man. Once a ship was infested, the fleas simply waited for the next opportunity. The merchant fleet became a fleet of infection, spreading wide, Pestis from the east to the Mediterranean. When Mongol forces laid siege to Kaffa in 1346 and began dying in massive numbers, it became clear something extraordinary and terrifying was afoot. One of the most chilling legends of the Black Death spread claims that the Mongols, aware of the disease in their camp, hurled the corpses of plague victims over the walls of Kaffa using catapults. Whether this act truly happened or not, it captures the chaos and desperation of the moment. Soon after, Genoese merchants fled the city by sea, taking the rats, fleas, and plague with them. By the time they arrived in Italy, the clock was ticking. Europe was unprepared. The conditions, crowded cities, poor hygiene, and growing trade networks, were perfect for an epidemic of unimaginable scale. And at the center of it all was a chain reaction that began thousands of miles away on the Central Asian steppes with a rodent and a flea. The disease that would go on to kill tens of millions didn't begin in Europe. It wasn't born in a witch's curse or celestial alignment. It was a natural phenomenon, one set in motion by ecological disruption, human movement, and biological opportunism. The Mongol Empire connected continents, and in doing so, opened the gates for the plague to walk through. Europe remembered the Black Death as divine punishment, a mystery, or even conspiracy. But the truth was far more insidious. A tiny insect, barely noticed, had already begun its deadly march westward, hitching a ride in the fur of a rat on the folds of a silk robe, on a journey from the silence of the steppes to the cries of dying cities. In the mid-14th century, the Black Sea was a bustling hub of international trade, where East met West in a complex dance of commerce and conquest. One of the most important ports in this network was the city of Kaffa, also spelled Kaffa, a Genoese colony located in what is now Crimea. Kaffa was a fortress city, a vital outpost for European merchants operating in Mongol-controlled territories. But in 1346, this strategic port became the unlikely setting for what some historians argue was one of the first acts of biological warfare in recorded history. The Golden Horde, a Mongol Khanate that ruled much of the steppes, had long had a contentious relationship with the Italian merchants at Kaffa. Tensions escalated into open conflict when Genoese traders were accused of harboring fugitives. In response, the Mongols laid siege to the city, determined to reclaim what they saw as rightfully theirs. The siege dragged on for months. But then, something unexpected began to happen. Mongol soldiers started dying by the thousands. The disease spread rapidly through besieging army, cutting down soldiers with terrifying speed. The symptoms were gruesome and unmistakable. fever, vomiting, swollen lymph nodes, and a swift, agonizing death. It was the plague. The Mongols, already fierce and feared warriors, now had an invisible enemy in their midst. Faced with their own mortality and the futility of continuing a siege under such conditions, the Mongol commanders made a fateful decision. According to one chilling account written years later by the notary Gabriel de Mussy, the Mongols catapulted the bodies of their plague victims over the city walls. Whether motivated by spite, desperation, or military strategy, the act was simple yet devastating. Send the dead into Kaffa and let the disease finish what their army could not. Imagine the panic inside the city walls. Decomposing corpses, bloated and blackened with disease, crashing into courtyards and markets. The people of Kaffa, already under siege, now face a new and mysterious horror. Infection spread quickly. But while it's unclear how much the Mongols' gruesome tactic contributed to the outbreak within the city, the result was undeniable. The plague had breached the walls. Soon, Genoese merchants and sailors began fleeing Kaffa by sea, desperate to escape the carnage. But unknowingly, they carried the very thing they sought to outrun. Rats scurried through their ships, drawn by food stores and filth. And on those rats were fleas, tiny, bloodthirsty parasites infected with Yersinia pestis. The voyage westward marked the beginning of the plague's journey into the heart of Europe. The Genoese fleet first reached Constantinople, where the disease quickly spread to the bustling Byzantine capital. From there, it leapt to ports throughout the Mediterranean, Alexandria, Marseille, Tunis, and finally, Messina in Sicily, the outbreak's European ground zero. In each city it touched, the pattern repeated. The plague erupted seemingly out of nowhere, infecting hundreds, then thousands. People collapsed in the streets. Entire families vanished within days. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. And all the while, no one understood what was happening. The connection between the fleeing Genoese ships and the disease was never made. The role of fleas remained an enigma. To the people of the time, it felt as though the world itself was dying. The tale of Kaffa has since become a symbol of the plague's sudden and brutal spread, a turning point when a local outbreak in Central Asia transformed into a global catastrophe. While historians continue to debate the accuracy of de Mussy's account, the strategic role of Kaffa in the plague's transmission is undisputed. It was a choke point through which the disease passed from east to west, aided by the very forces of trade and war that had connected the continents in the first place. And perhaps most tragically, no one in Kaffa realized that the true agents of death weren't Mongol corpses or Genoese ships. The real invaders were smaller than a fingernail, fleas, ravenous and infected, hiding in the shadows, waiting to bite. Their conquest would reach far beyond any battlefield. As Europe braced for what was to come, it had no idea that the storm had already begun, fueled by greed, war, and ignorance, and carried on the backs of rats and the legs of fleas. In the tapestry of the Black Death's horror, the most insidious threads were invisible to the medieval eye. For centuries, the true mechanism of the plague remained hidden, cloaked in superstition and misunderstanding. But modern science has unraveled what medieval minds could not. The silent, deadly role of the flea, a tiny parasite that turned the wheels of apocalypse with every bite. The primary culprit was the oriental rat flea, Xenocilichiopes. This flea was no ordinary nuisance. It had evolved a sinister relationship with a microscopic bacterium known as Yersinia pestis, the organism responsible for the bubonic plague. While fleas are parasites by nature, feeding on the blood of mammals and birds, why? Pestis transformed the oriental rat flea into a highly efficient biological weapon. Here's how it worked. When a flea-bitten infected rodent, often a black rat, Ratus ratus, it ingested Y, pestis along with the blood. Once inside the flea's gut, the bacteria rapidly multiplied. Unlike most pathogens, Y, pestis formed a sticky biofilm that blocked the flea's digestive system, specifically its proventriculus, a valve between the stomach and the esophagus. The flea could no longer digest food, and in its frantic hunger, it bit more aggressively. But every time the starving flea attempted to feed, the blockage caused it to regurgitate infected blood back into the bite wound. With each bite, it injected more Y, pestis, into its victim. In essence, the flea became a syringe of death. Driven by starvation, it spread the bacteria with every failed attempt to feed. Once the bacteria entered the human body, it attacked the lymphatic system. Victims developed painful swellings called buboes, hence the term bubonic plague. These buboes usually appeared in the groin, armpits, or neck and were often blackened with internal bleeding. Fever, vomiting, delirium, and death usually followed within a few days. But the flea's role wasn't limited to the initial infection. It was the key vector in a wider ecosystem of transmission. The plague spread through a triad: fleas, rats, and humans. When infected rats began dying en masse, their desperate fleas left other hosts: dogs, livestock, and most fatally, humans. In urban centers teeming with waste and filth, the infestation grew exponentially. Every home, every market, every ship could become a new epicenter. At the time, people had no idea what a flea truly was. Microscopes wouldn't be invented for another 3 centuries. Medical theory focused on imbalances of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, or on miasmas, poisonous bad air thought to cause disease. Few would suspect that the flea, so common and overlooked, was a silent engine behind the world's worst biological disaster. Some chroniclers did make uncanny observations. They noted that the disease seemed to follow rats and filth, and that it disproportionately struck the poor, who lived in squalid conditions. But without a clear understanding of microbiology or entomology, these connections remained conjecture. The deadly efficiency of the flea also lay in its size and resilience. A flea can survive for weeks without feeding. It can leap over 100 times its body length, and its flattened body and tough exoskeleton make it difficult to crush. Once inside a home, it could hide in rugs, clothing, animal fur, or floorboards, waiting patiently for its next host. As the plague advanced, fleas adapted to new environments. While the oriental rat flea preferred warmer, coastal climates, other species like Pulex irritans, the human flea, may have played a role in inland transmission. It's even possible that lice contributed in some areas, especially during colder outbreaks, further complicating the picture. The complexity of this web is striking. A single flea, biting a single rat, which later dies in a crowded alley, can set off a chain reaction of infection that spirals out of control. Multiply that by the thousands of rats in every city, and the result was inevitable. Understanding the flea's deadly secret rewrites how we view the Black Death. It wasn't just a medieval tragedy. It was a finely tuned biological event, a catastrophe engineered by nature and accelerated by human ignorance. As millions perished, the real killer scurried unseen beneath their feet, leapt from fur to flesh, and sank its needle-like mouth parts into skin, injecting the plague, one microscopic droplet at a time. As the Black Death moved inland from the ports of Sicily and Marseille, it found a new kind of host: the medieval city. Crowded, chaotic, and woefully unprepared, cities across Europe became death traps, amplifying destruction wrought by a pathogen no one understood and a parasite no one saw. From Florence to Paris, London to Lubeck, the story was the same: death came fast, and it came hard. Medieval cities were perfect breeding grounds for both rats and fleas. Streets were narrow, unpaved, and often choked with waste. Garbage was tossed from windows into alleys, mixing with sewage and the remains of butchered animals. Open marketplaces teemed with people, produce, and pests. Horses and livestock shared space with humans, and stray dogs and cats wandered freely. It was a world where sanitation didn't exist, and the line between human life and animal infestation was dangerously thin. The black rat, ratus, flourished in these conditions. It was small, agile, and fond of human dwellings. It nested in rafters, granaries, and food cellars, spreading with ease between homes, ships, and barns. Its passengers, fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, thrived right alongside it. In January 1348, the plague reached Florence, one of Europe's wealthiest and most vibrant cities. Within weeks, it became a city of the dead. The writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who witnessed the devastation firsthand, described the black boils that marked the infected, the abandonment of family members, and the mass graves dug outside the city walls. Entire households perished in days. Servants fled their masters. Priests refused to administer last rites. The social order unraveled. Boccaccio wrote in the Decameron, "Father abandoned child, wife her husband, one brother the other, No one could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. In Florence alone, estimates suggest that over 60% of the population may have died. The city, once teeming with commerce and culture, fell into silence. Similar stories echoed throughout Europe. In Paris, thousands of bodies were buried in communal pits. In London, the graveyards overflowed. The famous plague pits of East Smithfield were filled day and night with carts piled high with corpses. Mass burials became a grim necessity. In Avignon, the Pope had entire consecrated fields dedicated to burial. So many died that he ordered bodies thrown into the Rhone River. Despite the carnage, most city dwellers had no idea what was causing the illness. Some believed it was bad air from swamps or foul winds blowing in from the east. Others pointed to divine judgment, planetary alignments, or even malevolent outsiders. Superstition ruled where science failed. People burned aromatic herbs to purify the air. They carried posies in their pockets and wore amulets to ward off the invisible threat. Nothing worked. Ironically, some efforts made things worse. In desperation, towns slaughtered stray dogs and cats, believing they were spreading the disease. But these animals had been natural predators of rats. Without them, the rat population exploded, along with the fleas. Cities also responded by tightening control. Quarantines were enforced. Markets closed. Ports were blocked. But the fleas didn't respect borders or curfews. They simply found the next warm body and fed again. By the time any restrictions took effect, it was already too late. The death toll varied by region, but the pattern was consistent. Densely populated cities suffered the most. Places like Milan, which implemented early and harsh quarantines, fared slightly better. But even in these rare cases of limited damage, fear and misinformation reigned supreme. In cities where the social fabric began to collapse, so too did moral and civil order. Gangs looted abandoned homes. Bodies lay uncollected for days. The bonds that held communities together were tested and often broken. The plague didn't just kill people. It killed trust. And always, beneath the feet of the dying, in the cracks of floorboards and the folds of clothing, the fleas remained, feeding, infecting, spreading. The city was their buffet, and they dined without interruption. By 1350, most major European cities had been touched by the plague. Some never recovered. Others rebuilt, but in their memories and their bones, the terror remained. Urban catastrophe had been delivered not by armies or emperors, but by parasites too small to see. Fleas who made the city their kingdom of death. When the first waves of the Black Death struck the cities of Europe with unprecedented violence, many believed that salvation lay beyond the walls, in the quiet fields and rolling hills of the countryside. Urban dwellers, merchants, nobles, and even clergy fled to rural estates and remote villages, hoping to escape what they believed was bad air, divine punishment, or contagion that thrived only in crowded towns. But they were wrong. The plague did not stop at city gates. It followed the people and the fleas into countryside. What the terrified masses didn't know was that they were carrying the disease with them. Rats and fleas clung to their carts, hid in their clothing, or infested their animals. Wealthy families, servants, and peasants alike spread the infection unknowingly as they moved from town houses to manors, from markets to barns. In the quiet, peaceful villages they sought for refuge, they brought a hidden storm. The rural spread of the Black Death was slower, but no less devastating. While villages were less densely populated, they were also more vulnerable. Medical help was scarce. Priests, midwives, and local healers were often the only sources of aid, and most had little idea of what to do. Once the plague took root, entire communities were quickly overwhelmed. In many cases, villages simply disappeared. Chronicles from the time speak of hamlets where every inhabitant died. No one left till the fields heard the animals or ring the church bell. Overgrown graveyards and crumbling foundations are all that remain of these lost settlements. In England alone, more than 1,000 villages were eventually abandoned in the wake of plague. One particularly haunting example is the English village of Eyam, though its story would come later in a later plague outbreak in 1665. Nevertheless, it symbolized the rural fate of many communities. Eyam quarantined itself voluntarily after the disease was brought in by a merchant's infected cloth. Over a year, more than half the village perished, but their sacrifice likely saved surrounding regions from further spread. But in the 14th century, such self-sacrifice was rare. Most fled, and flight only made things worse. The social and economic effects of the rural plague were massive. The death of farm workers and peasants created a labor shortage. Fields went unplowed. Harvests rotted. With fewer people to tend livestock or produce food, famine followed in many regions. Grain prices fluctuated wildly. Entire feudal estates collapsed under the weight of debt, as lords lost the tenants who worked their land and paid rent. The feudal system, already showing cracks, began to fall apart. For the peasantry who survived, however, the plague brought an unexpected shift in power. Labor became more valuable. Wages rose. The rigid social hierarchy that had defined rural life for centuries began to erode. Serfs and peasants began demanding better conditions, and in some cases, gained freedom from their lords altogether. But this was not universal. In parts of Eastern Europe, landowners responded to crisis by tightening their grip, forcing peasants into more severe forms of serfdom. While Western Europe inched toward reform, the East regressed into stricter control. The consequences of the plague would ripple unevenly across the continent for generations. Religiously and culturally, the impact of rural devastation was just as profound. In places where every priest or monk died, churches fell silent, pilgrimages stopped, sacred festivals were canceled. Superstition took hold, especially in isolated regions. Stories of omens, witches, and divine punishment flourished in the vacuum left by clerical collapse. In some areas, people turned to folk healers or pagan rituals, desperate for relief. And still, throughout this upheaval, the plague's true engine, its carrier, was rarely seen or understood. Fleas did not distinguish between rich and poor, rural or urban. They bit anyone they could find. They lurked in haylofts, pig pens, and thatched roofs. In barns and bedclothes, they fed, bred, and infected. Country life, once considered a sanctuary, became another stage for the silent killer's performance. The countryside, with all its pastoral beauty, became a graveyard. Fields that once bloomed with crops became overrun with weeds. Roads grew quiet. Families vanished, sometimes without a single record to mark their passing. The myth that rural isolation could protect one from the plague crumbled under the reality that the true killers needed only a ride, and fleas were always ready to travel. In the face of a plague that decimated populations and defied understanding, medieval physicians found themselves powerless. The science of the time, such as it was, could not explain the rapid and gruesome deaths spreading across Europe. Physicians, surgeons, and apothecaries turned to ancient texts, astrology, religious dogma, and folklore, searching in vain for answers. While the true killer was crawling to the seams of tunics and the fur of rats, medieval medicine groped blindly in the dark. Medical knowledge in the 14th century was rooted in the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, classical Greek physicians whose ideas have been copied, translated, and reinterpreted for over 1,000 years. Chief among these ideas was a theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was believed to result from an imbalance of these bodily fluids. Treatments included purging, bleeding, cupping, and dietary adjustments, none of which addressed bacterial infection or the flea's bite. Doctors of the time also believed strongly in miasma theory, the idea that bad air, especially from swamps, rotting matter, or corrupted winds, was responsible for disease. It wasn't entirely baseless. Unsanitary conditions did correlate with outbreaks. But without germ theory, there was no way to understand that the transmission of disease was microscopic and biological, not atmospheric. As bodies piled up, physicians donned their most iconic plague armor, the beak mask. These plague doctor costumes, now infamous in modern popular culture, featured a long robe, gloves, boots, and a bird-like mask with glass eye openings. The beak was filled with aromatic substances, lavender, cloves, camphor, or even vinegar-soaked sponges, meant to purify the air the doctor breathed. A staff was used to examine patients from a distance or keep crowds away. Though visually imposing, the outfit offered no real protection from fleas or airborne bacteria. In many cities, medical faculties issued advice for avoiding the plague. Avoid eating melons, bathe rarely, avoid sad thoughts. Physicians even published treatises on how planetary alignments might predict outbreaks. The conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345, for example, was blamed by some scholars for corrupting the Earth's atmosphere and triggering the pestilence. These explanations, while earnest, border on the fantastical. Pharmacists and apothecaries sold all manner of remedies, herbal tonics, powdered gemstones, concoctions made from crushed emeralds, unicorn horns, often narwhal tusks, and dried toads. Wealthier households turned to imported perfumes and incense, while the poor relied on home-brewed potions. Most remedies were ineffective. A few, like aromatic vinegar or certain antiseptic herbs, may have had mild protective qualities, but nothing came close to a cure. Religious leaders also played a key role in healing, at least in theory. Many believed that plague was a punishment from God for humanity's sins. Public acts of penance became common. Flagellants, bands of roving zealots, paraded from town to town, whipping themselves in hopes of earning divine mercy. They preached repentance and self-purification, often stirring unrest and anti-Semitic violence as they sought scapegoats for the disaster. When clergy themselves began dying en masse, monks, priests, bishops, it further shook the population's faith. If even the holy men were falling, what hope remained? In some cases, entire monasteries vanished. With traditional institutions crumbling, many turned to fringe beliefs, mysticism, or isolation. Others gave up entirely, embracing hedonism or apathy. Hospitals, where they existed, quickly overflowed. In many cases, they became centers of infection rather than care. Nurses and caregivers died alongside patients. With no understanding of contagion or sanitation, physicians and attendants often used the same tools and garments on multiple patients. The concept of sterilization was centuries away. Despite the overwhelming failure of medieval medicine, there were a few who came eerily close to the truth. Some observers noted that plague seemed to follow ships and trade routes. Others observed the connection between rat infestations and outbreaks. A few even suspected that contact between the sick and healthy was a key. But without microscopes, germ theory, or a concept of bacteria, these observations remained fragments. Intuition without proof. In the end, medicine could do little. The Black Death swept across Europe with merciless speed, and doctors, armed with superstition and centuries-old theories, could only watch. As they bled patients and burned incense, the true killers remained untouched. Tiny fleas, immune to prayer and potions, hidden in plain sight. The failure of medicine during the plague was not just a tragedy of ignorance. It was a signpost for the transformation to come. Science, one day, would catch up. But in the 14th century, death reigned, and the doctors could only take notes. When fear spreads faster than understanding, humanity often turns to the oldest of responses: blame. In the face of the Black Death's relentless devastation, people across Europe desperately sought meaning. They scoured scripture, watched the stars, and hunted for signs in their dreams. But what they didn't see, couldn't see, were the tiny culprits under their own roofs. While fleas, rats, and microbes did the killing, millions looked elsewhere for answers. And in doing so, they unleashed a different kind of plague, one born of fear, hatred, and superstition. The scope of death was incomprehensible. Cities lost half their population in a matter of months. Entire villages vanished. Families were reduced to a single survivor. As the plague showed no signs of stopping, people began to believe that such destruction could only be deliberate. If this was not the work of divine punishment or a curse in the heavens, then surely it must be the result of human evil. The most tragic victims of this fear were Europe's Jewish communities. Already a marginalized minority, Jews lived in segregated areas called ghettos, practiced distinct religious customs, and were often viewed with suspicion. When the plague struck, rumors began to circulate. Jews were poisoning wells. They were accused of spreading the disease through arcane rituals or as part of a vast conspiracy to destroy Christian society. None of these accusations had any basis in fact. In reality, some Jewish communities suffered lower infection rates simply because their religious practices encouraged greater hygiene and separation from broader society. But in the eyes of the fearful, this difference was interpreted not as prudence but as guilt. Across Europe, Jewish communities were attacked. In 1348 alone, pogroms erupted in dozens of cities. Entire families were burned alive. Synagogues were destroyed. In Strasbourg, more than 2,000 Jews were killed in a single day. In Mainz and Cologne, entire Jewish quarters were eradicated. Many Jews fled eastward to Poland and Lithuania, where rulers offered them some protection. But the damage had been done. The Black Death became the excuse for one of the most widespread and violent waves of anti-Semitism in medieval history. But the blame didn't stop there. Lepers were persecuted as well, accused of contaminating water and food. Foreign travelers and beggars were driven out of towns. Witches and heretics were tortured and executed. Even those who survived the plague found themselves in society fraying at the edges, consumed by suspicion. And through it all, the real killers, the fleas, continued to feed and spread unnoticed. Part of the reason fleas were so easily overlooked was their invisibility in the medieval imagination. People did not understand how disease moved. They could observe symptoms, but not causes. Microscopes hadn't yet been invented. No one knew that bacteria existed, let alone that a tiny insect could carry it from person to person. Many people clung to spiritual explanations. Religious processions grew more intense. The flagellant movement swelled. Bands of barefoot penitents marched from town to town, whipping themselves in hopes of purging sin and stopping the plague. Their public displays, though intended to restore order, often incited panic and violence. Ironically, their constant movement likely spread the disease even further. Others blamed celestial events. Astrologers claimed that a rare conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in March of 1345 had released poisonous vapors into the Earth's atmosphere. This corrupted air theory, the miasma hypothesis, became one of the most widely accepted explanations for plague. In response, people carried sweet-smelling herbs and pomanders, burned incense, and avoided bathing, believing open pores made them more vulnerable. Meanwhile, fleas multiplied in bed linens, straw mattresses, and animal fur. They were there in the barns and bakeries, in the robes of traveling priests, and the clothes of fleeing nobles. But no one thought to look for the enemy hiding in plain sight. This failure to identify the true cause of the plague not only allowed the disease to spread, it deepened the social wounds it left behind. Hatred, paranoia, and mass hysteria gripped Europe. The plague didn't just kill bodies, it infected minds. And as one generation passed its trauma to the next, the memory of these dark years became etched into folklore, sermons, and nightmares. Even centuries later, people remember the Black Death as a divine reckoning or a cosmic curse. The role of the humble flea, so central, so lethal, was buried under layers of myth and misdirection. And perhaps that's the greatest irony of all. While thousands were burned at the stake and others whipped themselves bloody in city squares, the true villains would nestle quietly in the fur of a rat, taking their next blood meal in the shadows. By the early 1350s, the initial fury of the Black Death had passed, but the world it left behind was changed forever. Historians estimate that between 75 and 200 million people perished globally, with up to half of Europe's population wiped out in just a few years. Cities were gutted, villages abandoned, and dynasties extinguished. But the impact of the plague wasn't limited to graveyards. It reached deep into the genetic code of survivors, altered the course of science and medicine, and reshaped human history in ways still felt today. In the immediate aftermath, Europe was a continent in mourning. Fields lay fallow, churches rang silent, and guilds lacked apprentices. Skilled labor was scarce. Families had vanished. Entire generations had gaps where sons and daughters should have been. But amid this darkness came unexpected transformations. With fewer workers, the survivors found their value dramatically increased. Laborers, once bound to lords through rigid feudal contracts, began to demand wages. And when those demands were resisted, unrest erupted. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England was one such explosion of fury, sparked not just by taxes, but by the shifting expectations of a post-plague world. Feudalism, already cracking under the strain of economic changes, began to crumble. Landowners had to compete for peasants. Serfs gained leverage. In some regions, traditional hierarchies loosened, and a merchant class began to rise. The roots of capitalism and individual agency found nourishment in the ashes of the plague. Culturally, the Black Death also altered Europe's psyche. Art became obsessed with death and decay. Memento mori, skeletons, and grim reapers adorned everything from church walls to manuscript margins. The danse macabre, or dance of death, was a popular motif, symbolizing how death came for all, rich or poor, young or old. Religion was shaken. Though faith remained central to medieval life, many lost trust in the church, which had failed to protect them. Clergy had fled or died in droves. The vacuum of authority led to growing calls for reform, seeding movements that would later erupt in the Protestant Reformation. The spiritual certainty of Christendom had been fractured by fleas. But the most surprising legacy of the plague was written not in books or laws, but in blood. Modern genetic studies have revealed that the Black Death left lasting marks on the human genome. In 2022, scientists published findings showing that certain genetic mutations in survivors, particularly involving the immune system, became far more common after the plague. One such mutation affects the RAP2 gene, which helps the body detect and destroy bacterial invaders like Yersinia pestis. In simple terms, the people who survived the Black Death were not just lucky, they may have had stronger immune systems, and they passed that advantage on to their descendants. However, this evolutionary trade-off may have come with a price. Some of the same mutations that help people resist the plague may also make them more susceptible to autoimmune diseases today, such as Crohn's disease or rheumatoid arthritis. The very DNA that saved Europe from extinction may have predisposed it to future suffering. The long shadow of the Black Death isn't just historical, it's biological. And yet, for all this lasting impact, the role of the flea remained obscured for centuries. It wasn't until the late 19th century, when Alexander Yersin isolated the plague bacterium in Hong Kong during another outbreak, that science began to catch up. A few years later, Paul Louis Simon demonstrated that fleas were the vector. The mystery that haunted medieval Europe was finally solved, but too late for millions. Ironically, even as science identified the true culprit, Yersinia pestis and its flea couriers never truly disappeared. Plague still exists today in rodents across the western United States, in parts of Africa and Asia. Occasional outbreaks still claim lives. But now we have antibiotics, public health protocols, and a better understanding of transmission. The flea's reign as history's hidden tyrant is over, but not forgotten. The legacy of the Black Death, its demographic upheaval, its psychological trauma, its influence on art, religion, science, and even human evolution, all stem from a chain of events set in motion by the bite of an insect no larger than a grain of rice. Fleas did not merely ride the waves of history. In the 14th century, they steered them. As the 14th century faded into memory, the story of the Black Death became a dark legend, a nightmarish chapter marked by mass graves, ghost towns, and a haunting image of skeletal dancers leading kings and peasants to the same fate. But beneath the poetic tragedy and historical myth lies a harsh truth that remains relevant today. Civilization was brought to its knees not by armies or empires, but by a microscopic bacterium riding on the back of a flea. It's easy, centuries later, to view the plague as a distant catastrophe, but its relevance is far from gone. In fact, the lessons of Yersinia pestis and its tiny messengers are more urgent than ever. Disease doesn't just live in the past. It evolves, adapts, and waits. One of the most glaring lessons the Black Death teaches is that ignorance of disease vectors can be deadly. For over 3 years, Europe reeled from an invisible war against an enemy no one understood. Instead of identifying the true culprits, fleas and rats, society turned on its own. Jews, lepers, beggars, foreigners. Hatred became policy. Panic became ritual. And science had no voice at the table. That misdirection cost millions of lives. Even today, we still battle misinformation during pandemics. During COVID-19, rumors, conspiracy theories, and blame spread almost as fast as a virus. People hoarded toilet paper instead of masks. Politicians turned science into debate fodder. The Black Death reminds us, when fear overtakes reason, truth is the first casualty. Another crucial lesson lies in the unseen interconnectedness of our world. The plague moved from Central Asia to Europe through a combination of trade, conquest, and human migration. It followed merchants, soldiers, and refugees. The Mongol Empire's vast roads and shipping routes, once praised for economic growth, also became highways for death. Today, air travel connects cities around the globe in hours. A pathogen that once needed months to circle the Mediterranean can now span continents overnight. The fleas of the past have been replaced by the rapid transmission of viruses and bacteria. But the principle remains. In a connected world, local disease is global danger. Moreover, the plague reveals how disease reshapes societies far beyond death tolls. The Black Death helped bring about the end of feudalism. It led to worker revolts, increased wages, and social mobility. It planted early seeds of the Renaissance and, indirectly, for the Enlightenment. After facing death so closely, people began to question old systems, old authorities, old truths. Plagues don't just kill, they transform. But perhaps the most sobering insight comes from how long it took humanity to even notice the flea. For centuries, scholars argued about whether it was divine punishment, bad air, or witchcraft. All the while, the real engine of destruction was burrowed into mattresses, hiding in thatched roofs, feasting on blood. It wasn't until microscopes, germ theory, and a scientific revolution that the truth finally emerged. Even now, many diseases are still poorly understood. New pathogens lurk in jungles, permafrost, and factory farms. Climate change expands the habitats of vectors like mosquitoes, ticks, and, yes, even fleas. In many regions, plague still exists in wild rodent populations, flaring up now and then like a sleeping dragon disturbed. But we are no longer helpless. Today, we have antibiotics to treat plague. We have global monitoring systems. We have DNA sequencing, sanitation, epidemiology. And yet, the danger remains if we forget, if we ignore science, if we allow fear, pride, or politics to cloud our vision again. The story of the Black Death is a cautionary tale with teeth. It is a reminder that history's most powerful killers are often the smallest and the quietest. A single flea, insignificant on its own, becomes monstrous when multiplied across nations. A single mistake, unchecked, can cascade into a crisis. And so, the tiny killers behind the Black Death still whisper to us from the past, not in Latin or medieval chant, but in a voice that says, watch the small things, respect nature, trust knowledge, and never, ever underestimate what rides in shadows. Think the worst is over? The same flea-borne plague still exists today, only now we understand it. But how long before another tiny killer strikes again? Subscribe to the Crit Stories for more dark truths from the shadows of history. Leave a comment. What shocked you the most about the Black Death?